I finished my last lecture with the paintings of Baroque Spain's superstar, Diego Velázquez. The College Board did not include other Spanish Baroque works, at least Spanish Baroque works from Spain, on the list, but I worry that the focus on Velázquez is a little misleading. Velázquez was fundamentally a court painter, but the biggest customer for art by far in Spain was the church. And it is Spanish Baroque religious paintings that most deeply influenced Spanish colonial art, which is where we're heading today. So let's just glance at a few Spanish Baroque religious paintings. Zurbarán was a contemporary of Velázquez, again, deeply influenced by my guy, Caravaggio. Ribera is one of my favorite Spanish painters. Note the Baroque elements, the dramatic use of chiaroscuro, the emphasis on a saint, go counter-Reformation, the intentional foreshortening of the figures that move out into our personal space, what we've been describing as open composition. Murillo, not Velázquez, was for centuries the most admired Spanish Baroque painter. Note the resemblance to Raphael, Rubens, and even Titian. We see more emphasis on color than line, softer outlines, and frankly, a more sentimental vision. Okay, now we finally get to cross the ocean. Today we will only briefly encounter the civilizations that we will look at in much more detail in a later unit, the Aztecs and the Inca. Both civilizations were thriving when the Spanish arrived in the 15th century, although European diseases, which had arrived a few years earlier, were already devastating the indigenous population. At any rate, the art we will study today is Mannerist and Baroque, but heavily influenced by contact with the Aztec and Inca empires and with Spain's new colony in the Philippines, which brought the New World into contact with the civilizations of China and Japan. I'm going to ask you to watch this rather long crash course clip because it manages to give us a preview of the Aztecs and Incas, introduce the Spanish Empire, and review what's happening in 17th century Europe, all in about 7 minutes. Even I can't talk that fast. Back to the disembodied voice. Franciscan missionaries traveled to the New World as early as Columbus's second voyage, and from the very beginning, Spain was committed to winning the inhabitants of its new land to Roman Catholic Christianity. This is a complicated story with some real Christian heroes. Almost all of the efforts to protect indigenous people from forced labor, slavery, and other atrocities were led by priests. But sometimes the priests cooperated with mistreatment and oppression. Again, it's too long a story to tell here, but I do want to explore one very important document, if only briefly. The Spanish requirement, or requerimiento, pardon my bad Spanish pronunciation, was, by order of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, read to peoples that the Spanish conquered or otherwise encountered. Here is the opening paragraph. What mixed message does this send? A mixed message that's going to show up in Spanish colonial art as well. The phrase subduers of barbarous nations is not very subtle, though you should remember that Ferdinand is referring at least as much to the Muslim Moors that he had just expelled from Spain as to the Aztecs and other indigenous peoples of the Americas. But note that the last part of the paragraph also establishes a kinship between Spaniards and their new subjects. It is, sort of, a declaration of Christian brotherhood. Here is another double message. On the one hand, both the king and his subjects must obey a higher authority, St. Peter and his spiritual descendants, the popes. But of course, the popes gave the kings authority over these new subjects. And the final double message is, by all means, take your time, think over the claims of this new religion, be persuaded by the truth of what we are saying, or else we're going to make war on you, enslave your wives and children, and take all your goods. I think we'll see this confusing dual communication of promise and threat, brotherhood and subjugation carry through into the art of Spanish colonial America. You saw in the video that Spain divided its conquered territories into viceroyalties. Of the 4 works we will look at today, 3 hail from the Viceroyalty of New Spain, headquartered in Mexico City, and heavily influenced by contacts with the Aztecs and the people they conquered. But we will begin with a work that from what began as the Viceroyalty of Peru. Nope, this isn't a College Board required work. It's in your workbook because it's my favorite Spanish colonial Baroque work, probably because it's one I've seen in person in the Cathedral of Cusco, Peru. Zapata was himself Quechuan, or Inca. He and other indigenous painters learned mostly from prints of European paintings, and their style tends to blend local culture into the traditional painting of their conquistadors. I think you can all recognize the iconography of the Last Supper, but some Incan elements have crept in. The meat on the platter is cuy, or guinea pig. Cuy was the animal traditionally sacrificed at Inca agricultural festivals, so it offers a parallel to the lamb, the traditional Christian sacrificial animal. The dinner beverage is not wine, but a traditional Peruvian drink, chicha, made from corn. Like Caravaggio, this artist is bringing Christ into the recognizable lives of ordinary people, his people. But did the artist perhaps also manage to work in a critique of the Spanish conquerors? Note the figure of Judas. I've circled him in green, and you'll see he's clutching a money bag under the table. This Judas bears a striking resemblance to Francisco Pizarro, the conquistador credited with capturing and murdering the Incan Empire Atahualpa. Okay, this one is required work, and it's one of a very interesting group of paintings that I never knew existed. If you were to see this painting without any label or background, what period would you assign it to? I think it looks quite Mannerist, with the elaborate clothes, those soft, limp hands, even though they're holding a gun, and the distorted body. The head is too small, the body is too large. But the elaborate treatment of the textiles may also point to some Flemish influence. So what's that costume? The outfit is probably mostly inspired by the Viceroy Guards' uniforms. They were the only regular military force in the region. The painting on the right shows the guard escorting the Viceroy. The angel's jacket uses more cloth, but that's a traditional way of showing wealth. At the same time, the angel's costume includes elements of Incan royalty's traditional ceremonial costumes, which featured feathers and brightly patterned woven textiles. This gun-toting angel, also by the master of Cajamarca, offers a better comparison. The figure on the right is dressed in the traditional royal Inca garb for the Inti Raymi, or sun ceremony. These gun-toting angels showed up in paintings all through the Andean region. Here are three more. Interestingly, the Catholic Church, after the Council on Trent, had been cracking down on angels. They were too closely associated with magic and superstition. In the Americas, however, interest in angels was on the rise. Magic spirits had always played an important role in indigenous religion, and angels offered the church an opportunity to grab their would-be converts' attention with something that seemed, well, magical. And not just angels. What was more magical than those arquebuses, or muskets, which conquistadors had used to overwhelm much larger indigenous armies? In the counter-Reformation spirit of triumphal imagery, the arquebus also symbolized the conquering power of the Catholic Church. But miracles are not the same as magic, and the Catholic Church readily embraced miracles, especially those involving the Virgin Mary. My students all know this story. They attend Juan Diego Catholic High School, after all. The year was 1531. Cortez had conquered Mexico City just a decade earlier, but Franciscan missionaries had already won many converts to the Catholic faith. One of these converts was an Indian peasant farmer named Juan Diego. Juan Diego was walking to Mass along Tepeyac Hill when he began to hear strains of music. He looked up and saw a beautiful lady who called him by name. She introduced herself as the Virgin Mary and explained that she wanted a church built on this location in her honor. Juan Diego went off to see the bishop, which must have required some courage from a young peasant, but the bishop was skeptical and asked for a sign. Mary told Juan Diego to go to the top of the mountain and pick some flowers. He went up to the hill, which was dry and barren, basically a place where only cactus grew. There he found roses like those grown in Castilla, Spain, foreign to Mexico. He gathered the flowers in his tilma, a garment like a poncho. He brought them to Mary, who arranged the flowers and said to take his tilma to the bishop. When Juan Diego opened his tilma in the bishop's presence, the bishop saw not just the flowers of Spain, but the image of the Virgin. The church, no surprise, was built quite promptly. The images in the roundels surrounding the Virgin in this work tell the story of Juan Diego that I've just related, in more abridged form. Here's the image of the Virgin that now resides in the shrine of Guadalupe. The church was built on the site of a temple to the Aztec mother goddess, which the Spaniards had destroyed. More not very subtle symbolism of the Catholic Church's conquering power and its appropriation of indigenous traditions. So where does the imagery come from? One answer is the book of Revelation. I've put the passage on this slide. But the images also had great significance within indigenous cultures. So, for example, Mary's flowery tunic symbolizes the earth, while her turquoise starry mantle or cloak represents the heavens. The mantle also indicates that she's royalty, since only native Aztec emperors wore cloaks of that color. The three suns associate the Virgin with the light and potent power of the sun, again very important to Aztec religion. The black ribbon around Mary's waist shows that she is expecting a child. For the Aztecs, the trapezoid-shaped ends of the ribbon also represented the end of one cycle and the birth of a new era. The flowers on Mary's dress are made up of glyphs representing a hill and a river. The indigenous people, again, considered hills the highest point of encounters between God and people. An angel with eagle's wings appears below Mary's feet. According to Aztec beliefs, an eagle delivered the hearts and blood of sacrificial victims to the gods. The angel holds up the pregnant virgin, signifying that the child in her womb is an offering pleasing to God. Looking ahead to our Art of the Americas unit, on the right you see the Aztec goddess Coatlicue. According to the legend, Coatlicue was magically impregnated while still a virgin by a ball of feathers that fell on her while she was sweeping a temple. But note that all of these symbols also conform to the passage in Revelation and to symbols commonly associated with the Virgin Mary. Our required work isn't actually the famous image in the Guadalupe shrine, but rather a copy made in encochado style with inlaid mother of pearl. This was a technique invented in Mexico but inspired by Japanese art. Latin America and Asia were closely linked in this period because Spanish treasure ships, the so-called Manila galleons, regularly brought Mexican silver to Asia and Asian goods to Mexico. This work is signed by Miguel Gonzalez, who, along with his brother Juan, was considered the foremost painter of encochados. Note that this image depicts the Virgin placed atop an eagle perched on a cactus, Mexico City's legendary coat of arms. And this points to the Virgin of Guadalupe's increasing association with Mexican identity. And speaking of encochado, we're moving on to our next work, also from Mexico. I just talked about Mexico's ties with Asia via the Philippines and the influence of Japanese art. Excuse me. This work employs encochado, or shell inlay, but it combines this with another Asian-influenced Mexican genre, the Biambo, or folding screen. This work was commissioned by the Viceroy of New Spain and was probably displayed in his viceregal palace, where it would have divided a ceremonial stateroom from a more intimate sitting room. This is the side that important political visitors would have seen. The Khan Academy video on this work is really excellent, so I hope you watched it. I'm going to try to fill in just a few more details. The victory portrayed was the 1688 Battle for Belgrade. I mention the date both because it took place just before this work was created. This is a current news flash, and because there were, it turns out, a lot of battles for Belgrade. Some battles the Europeans won, and some battles the Turks won. No surprise, the Holy Roman Empire had won this one. They actually lost Belgrade again 2 years ago, and 2 years later in 1690. Wonder how the Viceroy explained that one to his guests. Control of Belgrade actually went back and forth until 1806, when the Europeans got it back for good. Today, Belgrade is the capital of Serbia. The level of detail is extraordinary. I've blown up the circled portion here, and here's a nice bloodthirsty scene of European heads on poles being handed up to the Turks. The Khan Academy video mentions that the scene from the Great Turkish War of 1683 to 1899 was based on a Dutch print. Here it is. These prints, especially the cheaper black and white versions, were very popular with Dutch citizens who were following the wars in Europe with great interest. Remember, there was no CNN back in those days. So, if this was the side that faced the formal reception room, what message did it send? Don't mess with the Habsburgs. The gold paint, the shell inlay, the shiny black paint imitating lacquer from Japan would also have showcased the viceroy's wealth and, of course, the wealth of Spain. This was back before electricity, so just think of how candlelight would have flickered off these shining surfaces. What other works that we've studied are designed to create a similar effect? How about mosaics? The decorative hunting scene on the reverse was more suited to the intimate women's sitting room that it faced. The hunt scene is based on Medici court artists' designs of tapestries for Cosimo I's villa. Both the main scene and the decorative borders are embellished with gold paint and inlaid shellwork, again, more sparkled by candlelight. What's most interesting about this work is that it's truly an international production, influenced by Dutch and Japanese art, yet produced in Mexico by local artists using local materials that imitate Japanese techniques. Globalization was already well underway. And this leads amazingly well into our final Spanish colonial work for this unit. I realize now that I probably should have stuck this painting into the next unit, because this is really a work of slightly later period than the Baroque. So here's a trailer for our next unit. It's all about scientific inquiry and rationalism. Remember how I talked about how each artistic generation tries to one-up the previous one? These folks were tired of Gopher Baroque and its appeal to emotions. Back to reason. Thank you very much. And even though it seems odd and more than a little offensive to us, this and other so-called casta paintings in part reflected a spirit of scientific inquiry. Think of your elementary school chemistry projects. What happens when you mix baking soda and vinegar? But of course, the casta paintings also carry a message about racial superiority. In fact, Mexican Creoles, that is, Mexicans of Spanish descent who hope to gain more power in Spain, often criticize these paintings. Any guess why? They were worried that the king and his court back in Spain would conclude that Creoles were mixed race, which would weaken their claim to self-rule. So here's a complete casta tableau that hung in the Madrid Museum of Natural History. Note, the Museum of Natural History, not a museum of art in the early 1800s. People would have examined it the way we examine dinosaur bones and Anasazi rope sandals. This wasn't art, it was science. The tableau should be read from top to bottom, and note our old friend, the Virgin of Guadalupe, is hovering protectively over all of the people. The couples in the top row have at least one European. Note the elegant clothing. Even the Indian woman in this painting is clearly upper caste, perhaps like the viceroy's wife, an Aztec princess. Move further down the tableau and the people get darker, the clothing becomes simpler, and in many cases, it isn't really clear in this image, the occupations become less elevated. The casta paintings were often produced in sets of 16. Notice that the descendants of Africans appear at the bottom, and note again how the clothing shifts with racial mixtures. So here on the left you see a mestizo and an Indian and their children. They are dressed in peasant garb, and the donkey and produce suggest that they are farmers. The Negro and Indian are showed with fruits and vegetables native to the regions where many descendants of Africans lived. Again, remember that this is meant to be scientific documentation. So, are these paintings entirely insulting to persons portrayed as belonging quite literally to lower races, lower on the page? The whole enterprise is off-putting to our modern sensibilities, but I'd argue that the paintings themselves offer surprisingly sympathetic portraits of the families. Remember, too, that these were religious people, and they would have been very familiar with paintings of the Holy Family. It strikes me that there's more than a little resemblance here. Now we're going to leave the world of Catholic Europe and its colonies and return for our last lecture to the new heart of the Protestant Revolution, the Netherlands.